Greetings and welcome to this virtual rollout briefing on the Arms Control Association's new report on nuclear disarmament summits, a proposal for rejuvenating progress toward a world free of nuclear weapons by our Director for Nonproliferation Policy, Kelsey Davenport, who's been with us here at the Arms Control Association since 2011. I'm Daryl Kimball, I'm Executive Director, and I'll serve as the moderator for today's virtual rollout event. After an overview presentation of the proposal outlined in our report from Kelsey, we'll hear from our two expert discussants for their take on the proposal. First discussant is Ulrich Kuhn, who's head of the Arms Control and Emerging Technologies Program at the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg. And then we'll hear from Scott Roker, who's Vice President of Nuclear Materials Security at the Nuclear Threat Initiative and former director of the Office of Nuclear Material Removal at the National Nuclear Security Administration and former director of nuclear threat reduction at the National Security Council. Kelsey is then going to provide some brief responses to their comments, and then we're going to look to you, our audience, for your questions to Kelsey and our discussants about the concept that we're presenting here today. Before we hear from Kelsey, let me just offer a few introductory comments on some of the things that prompted ACA to produce this report, which is now available on our website at armscontrol.org. The report, which was made possible with financial support from our members and from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, is a work that has taken quite some time to put together. Over the decades, global leaders and experts in our field have argued that the hard work of achieving progress on nuclear disarmament is a global enterprise that requires bold solutions and high-level political and public engagement. You might recall that in 2008, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon suggested that the UN Security Council should convene a summit on nuclear disarmament. 4 years later, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, former Senator Sam Nunn, former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry, and former Secretary of State George Shultz, they argued in a 2013 op-ed that a new multilateral effort on nuclear disarmament dialogue is needed. They said, and I quote, "Practical steps towards the goal of a world free of nuclear weapons will involve many nations, not just those currently in possession of nuclear weapons. Progress will require greater cooperation. The U.S. must work with other key states to establish a joint enterprise with common objectives to achieve near-term results," unquote. The four authors also suggested that the Nuclear Security Summits process, which the Obama administration kicked off in its first term, could provide a model, they said, for leaders working together to create a joint enterprise that would create a coalition of willing states to establish priorities to achieve progress on specific steps. Partly inspired by this vision, the Arms Control Association and Kelsey began research, writing and speaking about how a nuclear disarmament summit process might work in practice. In the decades since, the dangers posed by nuclear weapons have only grown more acute, and the political divisions on whether and how to advance disarmament have become even more complex, underscoring even further, in our view, the need for creative new approaches that can break the impasse or sidestep those states that are blocking progress on bilateral and multilateral fora. So we believe that now is the time for visionary government leaders, diplomats, disarmament experts, and advocates to seriously explore, develop, and pursue bold new approaches that could be pursued in the years ahead to help augment and complement ongoing efforts, most of which are now stuck, and provide new impetus for action to reduce nuclear risks and jumpstart action on nuclear disarmament. So Kelsey's report provides a detailed analysis of how a series of nuclear disarmament summits might work and how they can contribute to renewed progress in the years ahead. And let me just finally say that we recognize that any such effort would be very challenging, to say the least. And I think Kelsey would also acknowledge that this report does not provide all the answers on how or why such an approach might be pursued. But our purpose here is to introduce this idea into the mix and to start a conversation about it. So with that, let's get the conversation going. Kelsey is joining me. And so, Kelsey, good morning, and please tell us more about the report that we have just published this week.
Well, thank you so much, Daryl, and thank you to everybody for joining us. As Daryl mentioned, this report has been years in the making, so I'm very excited to see the interest and look forward to your questions and your comments. But before diving into the report itself, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that this report really would not have been possible without the contributions of my former colleague, Julia Masterson. She was really instrumental in putting this report together, and I'm very grateful for her contributions. Also, a particular thanks to Scott and Ulrich for agreeing to join this webinar and providing some feedback. This idea, actually, I first began exploring this at a workshop that Ulrich convened in 2016, and began working on this with colleagues Piotr Toczykonow and Jana Puglerin, and we published a piece on this in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, kind of exploring this concept. So very grateful to Ulrich for creating that initial space, and to the colleagues for some initial feedback. So to dive into the report, I think the goal of nuclear disarmament is very well established in the international system. And the existing architecture that's designed to support disarmament efforts is an extensive array of bodies and treaty-based initiatives that really date back to the origins of the UN. And the first chapter of this report tries to lay out some of these forums, document some of the critical accomplishments, but also looks at areas where structural factors have impeded progress. Because while these bodies have produced significant accomplishments, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, of course, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, numerous arms control agreements, confidence building measures, we've really seen progress on disarmament stall, particularly in the past 10, 15 years. We're seeing the erosion of critical norms that have supported the disarmament architecture and progress on disarmament, and in some areas, even reversal of past gains as states began to invest in new systems, nuclear systems that are destabilizing. States threatened to return to nuclear testing. And additionally to these challenges, the existing architecture is struggling to contend with some of the new technologies, some of the new security developments that challenge arms control. So that really raises the question, what's causing this impasse? So to understand how we can move forward, I think we need to kind of look at some of the factors that are contributing to this moment where we are now. And of course, it's common to point to geopolitics, the return to great power competition, Russia's very blatant rejection of nuclear norms. All of these are significant factors. But there are structural factors within the disarmament architecture itself that have contributed to this impasse. Some of these factors impede some of the creative and flexible thinking that I think we need right now to address the new and emerging challenges. And some of these factors also can be deliberately exploited by a state or a group of states to stall progress. So this report in the first chapter kind of really looks at three of the structural factors that I identified and tries to touch upon how they show up in the existing architecture to prevent initiatives from moving disarmament forward. And the first is membership. Some of the initiatives, some of the forums really don't include all of the states that are necessary to advance disarmament. One obvious divide, of course, is between the P5, the recognized nuclear armed states, and those that develop nuclear weapons, outside of the treaty, India, Pakistan, and Israel. Another membership issue that can impede progress is that membership in some of these forums is overly broad. When you have, the entire membership of the UN body, all of the states within the NPT, that broad of membership can, really impede some of the focused conversations that can be necessary to dive into, where progress needs to be made, what areas need to be discussed further. So that overly broad membership can also be a challenge. The second factor I would draw out is consensus-based decision-making. A lot of these forums, require consensus to adopt recommendations like the NPT review conferences, of course, or even to adopt agendas like the Conference on Disarmament. So over-reliance on consensus-based decision-making can really lead to, least common denominator recommendations for progress, these recommendations become watered down to get all states on board. And it's very clear how one state can impede progress, perhaps for political or even unrelated reasons, and really sort of gum up the disarmament architecture. The third factor that I identified in this report is, despite the common goal of nuclear disarmament, despite the existence of these forums, none of them really have systemic high-level political participation. Even the NPT review conferences, which occur every 5 years, states are not participating in these at the ministerial or head of state level. So that, I think, that translates to kind of less political impetus to pursue disarmament. There's less peer pressure within the system when leaders aren't showing up, and also less public scrutiny. Many of these meetings don't generate the press and attention that could then result in greater public pressure. So in combination, then, if you look at these three factors, when they're present, when more than one are present, within one of these forums, it can be even more likely to hinder progress. When you have overly broad membership and consensus-based decision-making, there's a greater risk that one state or a small group of states, will block the recommendation of key recommendations. And also, as we're seeing right now, particularly with the case of Russia, these factors really allow one state to exploit these structural processes to really halt progress. And we're seeing that, as I said, quite clearly with Russia in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine. Now, none of these factors are revelatory. Of course, we're all well aware of the challenges that come with consensus-based membership. The challenges, with consensus-based decision-making, the challenges that can come with broad membership. But what I want to underscore in unpacking these is that we have an architecture that can be effective, but it currently is not. So when we think about solutions to try to re-inject momentum back into the disarmament process, we have to be careful that we are not reproducing the structural factors that are currently impeding progress. And that's where the idea of a series of summits modeled on the Nuclear Security Summit process really comes into play. I think the disarmament architecture could benefit from a new time-bound initiative that would reinvigorate disarmament efforts without trying to replicate the structural processes or the structural factors that are impeding progress, and without trying to reinvent the entire disarmament system, because we do know that the existing architecture, they said, can work. So why the Nuclear Security Summits as a model? For those of you who are less familiar with this process, the Nuclear Security Summits were an initiative of former President Obama. This was a 6-year effort that was really focused on securing weapons-usable material from civil nuclear programs, and drawing attention to and reducing the risk of nuclear terrorism. Now, prior to the NSS process, which lasted from 2010 to 2016, nuclear security was discussed in other nuclear forums, but I would argue it wasn't a priority issue. And similar to where disarmament is today, I think we were seeing very minimal progress on nuclear security within these existing institutions. And I would argue that they were not responding to some of the new and emerging threats posed by the risk of nuclear terrorism that had emerged. So the Nuclear Security Summit really prompted states to take tangible steps to strengthen nuclear security, to establish new nuclear security norms, and I would say to reinvigorate how states think about nuclear security within the existing institutions where nuclear security was discussed. And several characteristics in particular, I think, contributed to that success. And I think these characteristics in particular would be important to consider in a disarmament summit process. The first is that the Nuclear Security Summit participants, were carefully selected, and states were encouraged to be represented at the head of state level. This brought really focused, high-level political attention to the issue of nuclear security. It also, I think, created sort of a peer pressure, where leaders wanted to show up and demonstrate that they were able to deliver tangible results, that they were taking the process seriously. The head of state process also, I think, created more media and public scrutiny. So again, more pressure on states to deliver, tangible nuclear security outcomes. The second characteristic I would identify is that the security summits were organized around, a consensus communique. So there's a sort of a shared organizing principle and goal that all of the states, signed up to. It outlined what the process was meant to accomplish. I think this was crucial in keeping states focused on nuclear security and in ensuring that other issues didn't enter into the conversation. Third, and I think most importantly, the Nuclear Security Summit process from 2010 established this idea of commitment making to build on the consensus communique's goal. So what does that mean in practice? Well, at the 2010 summit, ahead of that summit, President Obama encouraged the states to show up with what were sort of colloquially called House gifts or national commitments. So leaders were encouraged to announce specific national pledges to enhance nuclear security, at the summit process. And at the 2012 summit, that was expanded to what are known as gift baskets. And these were multilateral collaborative efforts by a group of states to focus on addressing, particular issues. Some of these were technical in nature, efforts, for instance, to develop, new fuels for medical isotope production. Some were focused on new threats, like addressing cyber risks, and others, committed states to take action at the state level, but within this shared context of the sort of the gift basket. So states were acting together. And here I think we saw some critical establishment of some new norms. And really what this process did was I think it spurred action beyond the status quo. And over the course of the summit process, we saw states that maybe were reluctant to act at the beginning take on more and more ambitious commitments. And really amplifying the importance of the commitment making process, was the fourth factor that the fourth characteristic that I would say was important. And that was the expectation of accountability at the summits. It was expected that leaders would come back to the second summit, the third summit, the fourth summit, and report on the progress that they had made on these national commitments and these multilateral commitments. This, I think, helped ensure that the commitments were feasible, that they actually could be tangibly implemented. And the fifth factor that I think is important and would need to be included within a disarmament summit process is that a summit process should also build on and recognize existing initiatives and processes. And this is something that I think the Nuclear Security Summit did as well. It drew attention to and expanded nuclear security efforts within some of the existing institutions, like the Global Partnership Against the Spread of Weapons of Mass Destruction and the Global Initiative to Combat Nuclear Terrorism, and helped highlight and bolster that work. So again, this idea that we don't need to reinvent processes that can be effective, that are working towards tangible outcomes, but a summit process could lift, expand, and strengthen those. So based on those characteristics, the third chapter of this report, recommends a series of disarmament-focused summits that really builds on these characteristics to jumpstart disarmament. So what would this look like? Well, ideally, a state or perhaps a small group of states or, an individual such as, the UN Secretary General, would commit to hosting several high-level state summits, perhaps, 3 or 4 summits every 3 years, enough to provide some momentum and to build some new norms, but before we get to the point of summit fatigue. Participating states would be very carefully selected based on the role that they play within disarmament efforts. Ideally, this would include, all of the nuclear armed states, states that rely on extended nuclear deterrence commitments, but also, states that are affected by nuclear weapons production or states that have tried to lead in this space in the past. The summits themselves would be, organized around a communique that I think clearly supported the goal of disarmament and set some general principles that states could then use to spur thinking on the commitment making at both the national and multilateral level that would build on the communique's goals. I think initially, we should expect that, the commitments would be modest, but that they would grow, over time. Now, within the report itself, I include some ideas of national commitments and multilateral commitments. These range from greater transparency regarding stockpiles to greater transparency around missiles to mitigating some of the environmental and health effects from nuclear testing and weapons production. But I want to be very clear that these lists are not intended to be exhaustive, merely illustrative of the types of commitments that states could think about making, within a summit process. I mean, the point of this commitment making is to really spur, creative thinking, to encourage states to go beyond some of the status quo recommendations that we may see in an NPT review conference, for instance, and really kind of build into this idea of more flexible and creative approaches to address, specific issues. And then, of course, there would be agreement from the onset that any disarmament summit process, would include, self-reporting. And I think one of the questions to consider, if this such a process, were to take off is, should there be common reporting? Should the reporting be ad hoc as it was in the nuclear security summits? And what are kind of the pros and cons of different ways of recording and documenting the results of this process? So that's sort of our idea for what a disarmament summit process would look like. And the idea here, again, would be that the commitments that were made, the norms that were established, that these would eventually sort of feed back in to bolster the existing architecture, that these recommendations could be built upon in, say, the NPT review conference or in other forums. So again, this would be an injection of momentum and a refocusing of political effort and political will, on this disarmament question. The summit process is not designed to, replace, any of the critical architecture that already exists. And again, as Daryl said, I do want to acknowledge up front that this would be, of course, a serious undertaking, as any type of head of state summit is. And there are significant challenges and significant questions that, I'll be honest, I don't think we fully explored or answered within the report itself. I mean, who should host this type of process? I mean, the nuclear security summits were hosted by first by the United States. But is the US the best positioned right now, given the security environment, to take on a disarmament summit process? Or would US leadership invite some states to self-select out? I think that's a question we have to think about. How do we deal with the likes of North Korea and Russia? Again, that's a question that I don't think we fully answered in the report. Of course, their participation is critical, but we've seen Russia in particular, I think, deliberately disrupt the disarmament architecture over the past several years. And I don't think we want to perpetuate that within a disarmament summit process. So again, significant questions here remain. So I hope that this proposal will spark a conversation, that I acknowledge that it's an incomplete idea, but I do strongly believe that it is the time to be thinking about new approaches to inject some additional momentum into the disarmament process and reinvigorate disarmament efforts globally. So I will stop there, and I will look forward to feedback from Scott and Ulrich and to your questions. So thank you again.
All right, wonderful. Thank you, Kelsey, for that overview again. For those of you who have not seen the report, it is online at www.armscontrol.org. Let me just ask Kelsey to come back on camera along with Ulrich and Scott. And we're now going to turn to our expert discussant. So I introduced earlier Ulrich Kuhn, who's the head of the Arms Control and Emerging Technologies program at the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg. We're going to start with Ulrich, who's going to offer his thoughts and comments, and also Scott Roker, who is vice president of nuclear material security at the Nuclear Threat Initiative and in Vienna, Austria, where climate change is a bit of a problem for Austria today. And we've sent Ulrich and Scott advanced copies of the report, and we've asked them to offer their thoughts and perspectives on it. And in particular, we were looking for their thoughts on why might this concept be worth pursuing, what it might help accomplish, and also what are the limitations or drawbacks. What considerations, challenges, problems does the report not adequately take into account, either in terms of building support for the concept, executing it, or in terms of what the limitations of the whole process might be? And what recommendations would you offer for improving the concept as we go forward? So those are some of the questions we asked, but we're not quite sure where they're going to go with their comments. And just ask Ulrich to start us out. And then after we hear from the two of them, we're going to turn to audience questions, and you can put those in the Q&A. We'll get to as many as possible. So with that, thanks for being with us, Ulrich. Good afternoon, good morning.
Good afternoon. So let me first congratulate Kelsey and the entire team at ACA for this extremely timely, creative, and forward-looking report. Let me offer a couple of insights from recent scholarship on nuclear weapons policies, as well as provide some hopefully constructive feedback on this bold proposal. Let me start by making the case why we would need such a concept. So, as we all know, all nuclear weapon states are currently modernizing their arsenals. Nuclear dangers are on the rise. All in all, 5 nuclear powers are directly or indirectly involved in a war over Ukraine. That is Russia, the United States, France, Britain, and NATO. In addition, bilateral arms control between Russia and the US has broken down. Bilateral arms control between Beijing and Washington is not in sight. Multilateral disarmament is deadlocked, for instance, in the NPT framework, and despite a growing number of states making the case for the TPNW. So it is clearly high time to jumpstart nuclear disarmament. Now, the report suggests an interesting new format, and that is minilateralism. What does recent research on nuclear weapons and minilateralism in particular tell us about the limitations of the concept? Let me start by referencing a political scientist, Megan D., who in a recent publication differentiates between 2 forms of minilateralism: inside and outside minilateralism. Let me explain. Inside minilateralism refers to groupings of states that try to advance the goals of a certain multilateral institution by staying within the boundaries of that very institution. So examples would be the NPDI and Stockholm Initiative, which stay deliberately within the confines of the NPT. On the other hand, outside minilateralism is pursued explicitly apart from established multilateral institutions with the goal of overcoming perceived weaknesses or challenges within those institutions. And here examples might include the NSG, the PSI, or IPNDB. Now, the nuclear disarmament summits, as suggested by Kelsey, seem to fall into the latter category of outside minilateralism. At least that is my understanding. Now, Megan D. argues that nearly all outside minilateral groupings in the global nuclear order are initiated by nuclear weapon states. And this tends to conform with the argument that states with the greatest material power in pursuit of their own advantage will advance coordination activities where they can best control outcomes. Now, obviously, this works as a deterrent for many non-nuclear weapon states to participate in those activities, and it is a clear downside of outside minilateralism. And that brings me to my first point in terms of building support for the concept. It's all about leadership. The report is skeptical, and Kelsey just mentioned that again, about the perceived advantages of the US leading such an endeavor. I agree. Instead, it offers 2 alternative leadership proposals: either a process led by the UN Secretary General or leadership by a group of middle powers dedicated to the goal of nuclear disarmament. Now, as for the latter, I am skeptical. a couple of years ago, I would have said that countries like my own, Germany, and perhaps Japan, would be perfectly suited and willing to assume such a leadership role if that is not in contradiction to US policies. Today, however, I see much less appetite in these countries for these kinds of proposals. Also, Megan D finds that non-nuclear weapon states, and particularly middle powers, usually take on leadership roles inside minilateral groupings. Therefore, I think that the option of UN leadership, as mentioned in the report, is the more realistic one. A recommendation in that regard. The UN Summit of the Future takes place this month in New York City. The summit will produce the so-called Pact for the Future, which has a subchapter on furthering disarmament and non-proliferation. And there, under Action Point 27, the pact the current version of the pact suggests recommending that the General Assembly hold a fourth special session devoted to disarmament. Now, if UN member states agree to hold such a fourth session, one of the deliverables could be the envisioned nuclear disarmament summit series. However, it would need significant US buy-in and political support from the very beginning. I don't want to get into the rabbit hole of the outcome of the US elections, but I want to stress that I see good reasons for Washington to support such a process. Why is that? Well, because the US is thinking in terms of competition. And I would argue that currently America is losing competition to China. Not when it comes to military power, as many stress these days, but when it comes to the competition of ideas. The fact that China recently managed to get on board 53 African states for their No First Use Pledge initiative should give decision makers in Washington pause for thought. A new minilateral disarmament effort led by the United Nations and supported by the United States at the highest level of leadership, and including key powers from the global south, would certainly be a powerful signal from Washington towards those countries. Taking the ACA proposal forward, I would suggest stressing the potential benefits for the United States in supporting such a process. I think the report is currently a bit light on that point. Now, one of the big differences between the Nuclear Disarmament Summit proposal and the nuclear security summits of the past is the focus. Under the nuclear security summits, the focus was on nuclear terrorism. That is, the threat resided outside of the classical nation-state framework. And it was clear that it was a common threat shared by all. The focus of the nuclear disarmament summits would be on nuclear weapons. That is ultimately the threat of nuclear use, which clearly resides within the classical framework of nation states. And that means the addressee is a different one, and that will certainly complicate matters. The fact that the report discusses the option of somewhat bypassing Russia points to these complications. By the way, I would strongly urge to make all the necessary efforts to include Russia, because if Moscow is not on board, for whatever reason, China might as well opt not to participate, and then I would argue this thing is dead in the water. A few final remarks about the touchstone of the endeavor, without getting into the details of the suggested topics for gift baskets. I concur with the focus on non-use, Article 6 commitments, and the Reagan-Gorbachev statement. I am much more hesitant to identify risk reduction as a fruitful avenue in terms of a broader objective. I think recent years have shown that despite, and perhaps even because of increasing nuclear tensions, states are much less willing to engage in meaningful risk reduction. Some even see risk manipulation as the main purpose of successful deterrence and compellence efforts. As I said at the beginning, this is a bold proposal. I personally like bold proposals. I think that this is exactly what we need today if we want to unlock nuclear disarmament. It would be too easy to dismiss this proposal simply by pointing to great power competition and great power's nuclear modernization programs. Instead, I think we need creative, forward-looking proposals, and this is one. And I would argue to the audience, it deserves your attention, and I hope that ACA will continue to push for that concept. Thanks for now.
Thanks very much, Ulrich. Very thoughtful, insightful comments. We'll now turn to Scott Roker. Thanks for being with us once again. Floor is
Thank you,
yours.
Daryl. And thank you, Kelsey, for a wonderful report. It's really excellent, and I agree with Ulrich that it's a really creative and ambitious idea, and really gave me a lot of thoughts. And I think the timing of it's also really important. I've been feeling in the last year or so that there's been sort of a lack of relevancy around the Nuclear Security Summit process, which is kind of obvious. It's been 8 years, more than 8 years since we've convened the most recent one in 2016. But there's a lack of awareness around what that process did and how it was successful. And so I really appreciate you kind of bringing it front and center again through this report. And so I kind of want to share thoughts based on my experience in working on the Nuclear Security Summits. I was fortunate enough to be a part of 3 of those summits from different angles. And so, with that in mind, I want to talk about, I have 4 points I wanted to mention sort of around the structure of it. And I think to start, having it at the leader level is absolutely key. When leaders come to an event, they want to do something. They want to announce something. They, in the process of preparing for the summit, they'll be asking questions, and they can really make change and make progress within their system. And so I think having it at the head of the state level is hugely important. And it's equally important for the house gift concept that you talked about. When a country would come to a nuclear security summit, if they came with a meaningful house gift, they got an opportunity to, share the stage with the U.S. president at that time. And that was a big incentive. And it spurred all of these negotiations between the United States and other countries and amongst other countries that otherwise wouldn't have taken place. And so I want to give an example. One of the examples I like to point to is the agreement that was one of the headlines of the 2014 Nuclear Security Summit, where Japan agreed to remove all of its highly enriched uranium and separated plutonium from its fast critical assembly facility just north of Tokyo. And this was a really significant commitment. It took several years to negotiate it. And I feel like if we didn't have a 2014 Nuclear Security Summit as a deadline for those negotiations, it would have dragged on potentially. But it was successful. And when that agreement was reached, it was very much thought that, well, this work could get done in about 5 years. But, a president doesn't want to come back to another nuclear security summit and not be able to provide some progress report. And so what ultimately happened was that work got done in 2 years. And so we really saw this acceleration of work on nuclear security. And that's, I think, a really important piece when you're thinking about a disarmament summit. So my second point kind of relates to that. It's the frequency in terms of how often these summits would take place. That's another thing you need to think through very carefully. In the case of the nuclear security summits, they took place every 2 years, as you noted. But so that was really important in terms of accelerating the work and getting things done in a timely fashion. But there was also summit fatigue, right? This was a lot of work for countries to prepare for these. And so, we were hearing rumblings from time to time about the pace of summits and too many summits. I think, everyone would gladly take another summit now, 8 years after the last one. But the frequency is another really important factor to think about. A third area is that it really needs to have a pinpoint focus as much as it possibly can. And that was something we worked really hard to do in the Nuclear Security Summit process. We didn't want to talk about nonproliferation. We didn't want to talk about disarmament. There were other forums for those conversations. That said, we couldn't totally escape the issue. You'll see in each of the communiques, the language that was repeated in each one saying, we reaffirm our commitment to our shared goals of nuclear disarmament, nuclear nonproliferation, and the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. So we had to have something on it, but we limited it to just that statement. Even the 2010 Nuclear Security Summit was very much focused only on nuclear security. Then from the participants who were in the process, they really wanted to talk about radiological security as well. And so that entered into the 2012 summits. And so, but having that really tight focus was helpful in terms of getting around some sensitive issues and to, really focus on the task at hand. And so, when you think about it in the Disarmament Summit context, this is going to need to be relevant for non-nuclear weapon states. And that will need to be deliberate in the agenda. And I think you actually struck a nice balance of that in the report itself. And then the final sort of overall point I'll make is about how to convene this. And so I'll disagree a little bit with Ulrich here, where I see the benefits of having a state convene a summit. We had a lot of challenges with the multilateral institutions that support nuclear security in the summit context. It's particularly the International Atomic Energy Agency. It was tricky for them to accept sort of the outcomes of the summit because it was a limited number of participants. Not every IAEA member state was at the table. And so that caused issues within some of these multilateral organizations. And so it's hard for me to understand how you would get the right grouping of countries if it is convened through a multilateral organization. And there was the added benefit of, there was a charismatic U.S. president that people wanted to work with. And it was his personal interest in nuclear security that spurred this. And I think that's an important point, too, when thinking about this. A lot of the times when we've made progress in nuclear security, it's been based off a negative event. The fall of the Soviet Union, we saw cooperative threat reduction put into place to help secure nuclear materials across the Soviet Union. After 9/11, there was a strong effort to strengthen the treaties around nuclear security, the amended Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material and the International Convention on the Suppression of Acts of Nuclear Terrorism. The nuclear security summits weren't spurred from some negative act. It was really just the interest of a state who wanted to make progress there. And so I want to talk a little bit about the national commitments that you mentioned in the final section of the report. I thought there were a lot of really good examples there. The first two focused on the transparency of fissile material stockpiles and the declaration of nuclear warhead stocks. That's actually an issue we considered in the Nuclear Security Summit process too. In the 2016 summit, we worked with countries to provide some transparency around how they secure their military materials of highly enriched uranium, separated plutonium. And we didn't find much interest. It was a little bit too sensitive for that process. You ultimately saw the U.S. Release about a two-page report about some of the work some of the procedures in place to secure those military materials. The UK shared a little bit as well, but nothing much beyond that. But I think it should be part of it, but it's a tricky issue. Another one I would note too is fail-safe could be another example of a national commitment that countries could make. So this is something the U.S. has recently committed to do. Basically what this is an independent review of the safety, security, and reliability of their nuclear weapons. So if there is some sort of accident, it doesn't lead to a catastrophic outcome. And so, it would be great to see other countries follow suit in that regard. And then I'll just end with two other observations before we go into the questions and answers. I was also thinking about how we've attempted to use initiatives within the disarmament space into the nuclear security space. And we haven't been very successful, unfortunately. The one that I'd like to highlight here is, there's obviously nuclear weapon-free zones. There's 7 of them across the globe in Africa, Latin America, across Asia, and several places in South Pacific. And so to kind of model this, we actually pursued a concept called HEU-free zones. And so similar to the nuclear weapon-free zone, this would be a commitment from a group of countries in a region to never have highly enriched uranium on their soil again. So it's one way to kind of note the minimization work that has been accomplished, and then have a commitment to not ever acquire that material again. Unfortunately, we've been working on that for years and have never really gotten any traction. So the track record for taking things from disarmament into the nuclear security space has not been successful. Again, not a reason not to try this, but it can be tricky at times. And then the final point I'll make, you suggested, Kelsey, in the report that the NSS process suggests over time that processes can build norms, and I think that that is accurate. And I think we've seen some of them hold, but I think we've seen some deterioration around those norms more recently, and I attribute that again to not having head of state level attention on nuclear security anymore. So it's important to once again have that head of state focus on this issue. And I think that's going to be something that would be important for a disarmament summit as well, having that consistent and even somewhat long-term attention from a head of state level. So I'll leave it at that, but look forward to the conversation that follows. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Scott. We'll just take a few minutes here to allow Kelsey to offer her reflections on some of the inputs from Uli and Scott, and then we'll go to some of the questions that have accumulated in the Q&A, where the audience, you can put your questions for Kelsey and the discussants. So Kelsey.
So thank you so much, Ulrich and Scott. As expected, I'm kicking myself on not having thought of a few of these ideas when I was writing the report itself. But I have to say, Scott, when you mentioned a fail-safe, I read something on fail-safe right after we finalized the design, and I thought about that, but I couldn't quite bring myself to ask the designer to redo it again to add it. But certainly agree that would be a good topic that for both think about in a gift basket form. But coming back to some of your comments, Ulrich, thank you so much. I think really thoughtful and important points. One thing that really intrigues me about, the idea of using kind of the Summit of the Futures as kind of a jumping off point is, one challenge that I think we did see with the Nuclear Security Summit process was related to universalization and, the idea that, why should states outside of the process adopt and support some of these ideas when kind of they weren't invited to the party. And, some of the gift baskets that I think were really critical from the summit process have since been, sort of turned over to the IAEA as information circulars for all states to sign up to, but we're not seeing a lot of states join these. And before he was IAEA Director General, Rafael Grossi said something about that process that I think was quite interesting, that basically said, you can't refer to nuclear security accomplishments, from the summit process and try to get all states on board because, it's politicized at that point because they weren't invited. So the idea of kind of a more sort of universal beginning and endorsement to the process, through the Summit of the Futures, I think, may be useful in trying to balance that idea of universalization versus the necessity of a select group of states, to actually be involved in kind of within the summit process itself. In terms of the comments on, U.S. leadership better and, better demonstrating, where a country like the United States, for instance, would benefit from a summit process, I think that's a really good point. I think in trying to demonstrate that disarmament has to be supported, more broadly than the states with nuclear weapons themselves, I may have bent over backwards a little bit to demonstrate the relevance to the non-nuclear weapon states. But certainly, I think making the case that the nuclear weapon states would benefit from this process, that it isn't aligned with their goals, is an area where this could be improved. Then also just regarding the leadership, one thing that, Daryl said that this report has been in the works for many years. What he didn't say is that we actually had finalized it and we're all set to launch it. And then, Russia invaded Ukraine and we decided to kind of step back and, rethink some of the ideas. And the leadership model that I had envisioned in kind of the first summit version of this report was, could you have a commitment for 3 summits, one hosted by the US, one by Russia, and one by China? So you have that immediate sort of buy-in. I certainly agree that, every effort should be made to include Russia. But I would be inclined at this point to think, how do we ensure that the United States and China are on board? And with the US and China on board, then, could we try to bring Russia along? And navigating that idea of ensuring that Russia is included, but without allowing them to derail the process, is certainly an area that I think is worth thinking more about. mean, I think North Korea certainly should be invited. One thought would be, if North Korea continues to refrain from nuclear testing, that could be kind of their entrance into the process. But certainly, I agree that thinking critically about Russia, thinking critically about how this addresses the interests of the nuclear weapon states without allowing them too much power within the process so that this becomes perceived as performative, I think is certainly an area that needs more thinking. I'll admit I haven't read the piece you referenced on kind of inside and outside minilateral processes. Certainly I would agree that this seems to fall more within the outside category, but one thing that I think is particularly important in terms of stressing multilateral commitment making is that it allows and can encourage some of these more inside type minilateral processes to grow further, right? I think there are a lot of ideas, within some of the groupings under the, that work within the NPT framework that could be further expanded upon, and leadership space could be created to really recognize and advance, some of those, ideas. So maybe I'll stop there and wait for the questions. But again, thank you for the really thoughtful comments, the really thoughtful feedback. Scott, your inside knowledge of how states responded to the frequency of the summit process is certainly noted. But I think again, trying to strike that balance of frequency so you don't lose momentum, but also so you don't have fatigue is certainly something that we'll need to take into account. And again, I certainly agree, about the value of that state level, leadership and political head of state leadership.
All right, wonderful. Thank you, Kelsey. Lots to discuss here. We have a number of very good questions coming in, and I'm going to take these one or two at a time and ask Kelsey to weigh in, and also be happy to hear from Scott or Ulrich about some of the questions coming in. The first one I wanted to put forward comes from Tony Jaquez, who, for those of you who don't know her by name, is a senior diplomat with the government of Mexico who has years of experience on nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation matters. She would like to hear comments on two issues that might be of concern in regards to the proposal, regarding the representation of all countries, or the lack of representation that can occur. Although she says there is a point in seeking focused discussion on these issues, the UN is suffering from a lack of participation. The Nuclear Security Summits process suffered from that problem, she says. So, Kelsey, talk a little bit more about the concept, we lay out in the report about participation in the process and the importance of not just having nuclear weapon states or nuclear armed states, but also leading non-nuclear weapon states, and how we might consider the challenge that non-nuclear weapon states have in participating in a high-level fashion when let's say their foreign policy teams are not quite as large as those of the nuclear weapon states that show up at these meetings.
I certainly think that the issue of participation is something that would have to be carefully considered. And again, I'm not pretending that our report has all the answers. It certainly requires more thinking. But I think in looking at some of the existing forums, one theme that I think became apparent as we looked at the challenges in advancing some disarmament related proposals within these forums is that overly broad membership really can impede progress. And so trying to find that balance between a group of states that is sort of small and nimble enough to have kind of those focused conversations that advance disarmament, and balancing that with, all states do participate in the disarmament enterprise. All states have a say in the disarmament enterprise. I think that will be really challenging. I mean, one thing that I think was interesting, from the Nuclear Security Summit process that might be worth looking at, and I'll admit it's an aspect of the summit process I don't know as much about, is there was what I would call sort of an outreach gift basket in the summit process, where participants kind of committed to discuss the sort of the nuclear security summit deliverables, to discuss some of the important commitments and tangible outcomes with states that were not participating in that process. So I think that's something that could be included within a summit process to try to ensure that states outside of the summits themselves had an idea of what was going on, could provide some input and some feedback. Even though, as I said, it's not, to me, I still think there's a very strong argument for limiting the number of states that would participate in this. I mean, certainly in thinking about the participating states, we should think about, geography. We should think about some of the different, factional blocks that, that exist, within the existing initiatives to ensure that those states are represented. So exactly kind of what that invitation list, comprises of, again, I think, need, further thought, but certainly, again, the balance between, a small kind of select, minilateral group that could really advance this agenda and universalization is a tension that I think really needs to be explored further.
Great. And there's one question we have from Balkrishna Curvy about how this process could help countries like India and Pakistan, which have decades of enmity between them, to overcome some of the challenges that have gotten in the way of their own dialogue on nuclear risk reduction and disarmament. If you could just explain that, Kelsey or Scott or Ulrich, if you'd like. I think that is one of the problems we had in mind with this concept. So Kelsey.
Sorry, Bill, you cut out there for a second. Could you just repeat that?
The question is, how can this nuclear disarmament summit's concept help address the obstacles that have been in the way between countries like India and Pakistan, who have had difficulty engaging in a dialogue on risk reduction and disarmament? Could this address that issue and involve those two countries in the disarmament enterprise?
Sure. I mean, I think that's a great question. I mean, one thing that I think can help in this type of process is that, by broadening the participants in the room, an issue can become, less sort of centrally focused on, a bilateral relationship, right? So where India and Pakistan may be hesitant to discuss a specific set of measures, within their own context and their own geography, given the political situation between these two countries, if we broaden it to include a principle that, more nuclear weapons, nuclear armed states were willing to consider or support or discuss, that could diffuse some of the tensions. But also, I think, if we look within the India-Pakistan relationship, there are even some interesting measures that these two states have agreed on in the past that could be a platform to explore further within the summit process. Some of the notifications that India and Pakistan, for instance, have agreed to, that could be a platform to explore kind of within the summits. So I think the summits can depoliticize some of those bilateral. Some of the bilateral enmities that can impede progress, by providing a more common platform. And I think again, the idea was raised, I think by Ulrich about China and the no first use, and I think we've seen some challenges to exploring that in the U.S.-China relationship. Exploring something like that at a broader minilateral level again could diffuse some of the the sort of immediate political tensions surrounding that issue that I think sometimes have inhibited debate in the U.S., for instance, on that topic, and provide the platform to explore it, and for a group of states more committed to try to take that forward. So again, I think in some ways, the disarmament summits can help advance some of these issues by depoliticizing some of the bilateral issues and moving them into a forum where it may be easier for states to discuss progress.
Ulrich, you wanted to weigh in on this, please?
Yeah, just really quickly, because in a certain way, I see that concept that you guys are suggesting here also as a bit of a counterweight to the overarching narrative of great power competition that seems to dominate everything these days. Because one thing that we should not forget when we talk about great power competition, the two-peer competitors world narrative, is that the moment where we see significantly the Chinese increasing their arsenal as a countermeasure to the US and so on, and these two countries getting into a dynamic, then forcing Russia into the dynamic, is a moment where we will see also increasing pressure on India to react to China's buildup, and that will increase the pressure on Pakistan to build up. So we see all these negative ramifications, and there I would stress that a concept that takes on the one hand, a more holistic approach, but on the other hand, a more focused approach on a significant number of countries to stop this negative overall dynamic would be worth pursuing.
Great, thank you. We have a couple of questions that are about how the nuclear disarmament summits process could avoid the possibility that nuclear weapon states utilize this to defend themselves against further pressure for action on nuclear disarmament. I assume by the question, the questioner is asking, whether they would own the process. As the question goes, how would the nuclear disarmament summits avoid becoming another fig leaf for nuclear armed states to forestall their obligation towards nuclear disarmament? Kelsey, I think we can answer that pretty quickly, but please go ahead.
Yeah, I think that certainly is a concern, and I certainly would not want a summit process to be perceived as a performative act that the nuclear weapon states could point to within the NPT context to say, oh, look, we're making progress, if that disarmament summit process isn't actually achieving kind of concrete goals. So I think the feedback from Ulrich earlier, I think is really critical in recommending to me that we need to kind of, I think, better sort of enunciate what the nuclear weapon states would benefit from within this process, how engaging within this process will meet their security needs, and again provide sort of tangible benefits from them. Now, again, I think the organizing principle, thinking about the specific language kind of within the communique, that would be particularly critical again for ensuring that states remain focused on a goal and then are encouraged to take tangible steps to implement, to achieve, or to move towards that goal. So I think again, kind of the relationship between kind of the communique and the buy-in to that principle and the buy-in to the commitment-making process, would be quite crucial in ensuring that this is tangible and that it's not, performative. And I was actually going to ask Scott if he would want to weigh in on that from some of the security summit processes, because I'd be interested in his take there, but he has his hand up. So, but yeah, so I would just, throw that out there, that those relationships, the initial buy-in, that will be quite crucial.
Yeah, I would actually take it a step further, Kelsey. I think that's one of the beauties of the proposal that you have in front of us. The nuclear security summits really had that tangible action, right? The countries came with house gifts or gift baskets. And so in this situation, countries with nuclear weapons couldn't escape that, right? And part of that process is the peer pressure, right? So, okay, the U.S. is committing to do, fail safe or whatever they're committing to do. It's going to put a pressure on the other countries to actually take some steps. And so I think this model really helps in terms of getting those tangible results.
Yeah, and one thing I would just add in terms of both the Nuclear Security Summit process and especially a nuclear disarmament summits process, it would be very important, and the written report describes this, for leading non-nuclear weapon states who have a long track record and credibility on the nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation issue to play a very meaningful and leadership role in organizing the summits themselves, the agenda, et cetera. One example from nuclear nonproliferation history, of course, is the decision in 1995 to indefinitely extend the NPT was an arrangement brokered by a strong group of non-nuclear weapon states, the New Agenda Coalition and the nuclear armed states. If it was not for the very strong and high-profile leadership of those non-nuclear weapon states, we might not have had in that outcome document in 1995 specific commitments by the nuclear weapon states to take specific nuclear disarmament steps as they relate to their Article 6 disarmament obligations in NPT. So, that's an example of how, especially in a multilateral setting, that leadership from non-nuclear weapon states is crucial, and I think would be needed once again if a nuclear disarmament summits process got underway. We have a couple more questions I wanted to get to. These are easy questions. These are good questions. Our colleague Bob Peters at the Heritage Foundation raises the question, what evidence is there that the international community, such as it is, will pressure Russia or China towards nuclear disarmament, when he notes the TPNW states are having difficulty doing so? Put another way, is the problem a lack of creativity about the form of disarmament talks, or is it political will? So, how might this proposal affect or influence let's say, the political will of the nuclear armed states to deliver? I mean, we've been touching on that topic, but Kelsey, if you could try to address that, and maybe Scott or Ulrich, you've got thoughts also.
I think it's both a lack of creativity and a lack of political will. I don't see the current architecture as generating significant pressure on existing leaders to take bold steps. I don't see leaders, trying to put pressure on the architecture to deliver bold steps or to promote creativity. And I think that some of the structural factors that I noted in the beginning kill a lot of the creative and flexible processes, within the existing structures currently, because of the geopolitical environment. So I think that that's why we need a new process that focuses both on generating additional political will and creating spaces for small groups of states to explore more creative ideas and advance kind of beyond the status quo discussions of the existing forums to see, how some of these ideas can really move the needle on disarmament. And again, I think to generate that, it does come back to these very critical questions of how do we ensure buy-in from a broad number of countries, and how do we ensure buy-in with the intent to act, from the nuclear armed states, because I think those two elements, are also crucial within that summit process to spur both the creativity, but also the political will and the political impetus. So that's sort of how I would answer that. Because if you look at, maybe if we kind of take, set Russia aside, but if you look at, what the US has said, if you look at what China has said, I think there is interest in pursuing certain ideas related to nuclear disarmament, but politics, the current architecture, isn't necessarily providing the forum, the space, to pursue those in this, politicized environment, sort of given the shifts in global security. So because I think there is still some interest there, that if we can bypass some of these structural factors and create that space, I think it could move the needle. But if others want to weigh in, I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, Ulrich, and then I have a couple of thoughts on this too. Go ahead, Ulrich.
Yeah, I'll just make it quick. I think we do not give enough agency to countries of the global south in these discussions. And the point here is countries like Russia and China, they do care about their international standing. They might not care in the first place what policymakers in Berlin, Paris, and Washington think about them, but they do care about what these countries, particularly the more powerful ones in the global south, think about that and think about them. And we haven't been creative enough to include these countries and to have a serious discussion with these countries about global nuclear disarmament issues.
Scott?
Yeah, this kind of relates back to the first question too about how you get involvement from all countries, and I agree that it needs to be only a select few that do actually get to go to the summit itself. And the idea that popped in my head was you could have a regional element to this, where there's you identify a region has a certain number of countries that participate, but there's a regional conversation that happens before the summit, and they can talk through what are those priorities of that region that can be shared by the people who do attend the summit itself. And you could actually get to some of these questions around the nuclear weapon states and priorities of those regions could help kind of spur that those changes.
I wish I had thought of that, Scott. That's a great idea.
Well, just I think Ulrich answered the question the way I was going to answer the question. It is an enormous challenge about how the international community writ large reminds the nuclear armed states, particularly the US, Russia, and China, that they are not meeting their Article 6 disarmament responsibilities right now, and that they do have an obligation to engage in good faith negotiations to end the arms race and on disarmament. But in theory, what this disarmament summits process could do is ensure that heads of state, who presumably would be there, that's the idea, could not escape discussion of that reality. And in the present context, at NPT preparatory committee meetings, at the TPNW meetings of states parties, at the UN General Assembly, as Kelsey said at the outset, because the representation at these meetings is at best at a foreign ministerial level, those countries can escape the scrutiny and the attention and the spotlight about what they're not doing to fulfill their disarmament obligations. They can escape hard questions about their nuclear buildups, their nuclear modernization, and so this would be a way that could hold them more accountable to their existing obligations, let alone encourage them to move in new ways in the direction of a world free of nuclear weapons. We have a couple more comments and questions I want to get to. We have a question and a comment from Nicholas Clutterbuck from New Zealand, who's with the New Zealand Foreign Ministry. He'd be interested in knowing what you think, Kelsey thinks, the scope of issues the summits might address, because it's certainly been our experience over the past 12 months in the NPT context that there are increasingly fewer topics and themes that the nuclear weapon states can agree on prioritizing and advancing. So how would you address that, Kelsey, and perhaps Uli and Scott?
Well, I confess I had an idea of what I sort of thought the scope was, and now with some of the feedback from Ulrich and Scott, I'm less confident in what some of the ideas and the themes should be. And I think the point Ulrich made about how we think about risk reduction and risk reduction and the manipulation of risk reduction is definitely something I want to think more about. But I come back to thinking that the overarching principle that would be sort of expressed within the communique probably does have to be a bit more broad because of, as you noted in your question, that there are fewer topics and themes that can be agreed upon, even amongst the P5, for instance. But I think, we've seen, support again, for something like, the Reagan-Gorbachev statement as kind of that overarching principle. And then, I would look back at, where we have seen, some agreement perhaps in past NPT review conference final documents that maybe, didn't make it to adoption, because of, because, perhaps consensus was blocked, because of a non-related issue, to see if there are, some themes or ideas where we've seen agreement in the past, and maybe try to think about whether a communique could reference or include those to provide then that touchstone for building off of, and then encouraging kind of creative ideas within kind of the commitment making process. So that is kind of my initial thinking. I would say that again, trying to find the balance between sort of themes and ideas that resonate with both the non-nuclear weapon states, and the nuclear weapon states, I think will be important. I mean, one thing that I did include in the report is, looking at, some of the questions regarding, the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons use, thinking about, environmental mitigation from testing, for instance, because again, I think that would also help demonstrate the relevance of the summit process to a greater number of states. I do think these issues are inclusive, within the disarmament process, and again, would provide areas where we would see where we could see meaningful progress early, because some of them might also be less controversial. I mean, mitigation at test sites, for instance, I think is an area where we've seen the United States and Russia, for instance, work together in the past with great success in the summit process, for instance. So that's sort of how I would kind of start by answering that question. But I'll admit I'm certainly rethinking some of the ideas proposed about risk reduction and how that plays in.
All right, very good. I mean, one other thing I would just note in response to that question is the issues that could be part of the scope of this meeting, the specific gift baskets and potential actions that are agreed to in a communique. These might change between now and 5 years from now, if and when this summit takes place. So, I mean, one thing I want everybody to keep in mind, especially as we have some questions about specific issues that are in the news right now, specific issues and problems. I mean, the idea that Kelsey's putting forward in this report is for states to consider this initiative. It could, as Ulrich suggested, be launched if the UNGA can agree to hold an SSOD4. That might be one launching point. Could be an outcome of SSOD4. But this is something that might not lift off, even under the best of circumstances, for another 3, 4, 5 years. So we also need to think about how the developments in the international system might change, what particular problems might emerge, et cetera, et cetera. And there may be new leaders in new governments by the time this develops. So we should not necessarily limit ourselves to thinking about who might be in the White House or at Downing Street, next month or in 3 months or whatever. So we have just a couple more minutes for some other questions here, and one of them that is showing up in several questions is, how could such a summit take place just, in the context of the deep disagreements between the United States and Russia, and I would add Europe and Russia, and the increasing antipathy between the U.S. and competition, the U.S. and China. Why would all 3 states want to participate in such a process? How could those challenges in the bilateral relationships be be overcome? And we've been answering that, I think, tangentially, but Kelsey, why don't you take a crack at that, and then maybe Scott and Ulrich have some thoughts about that challenge that I think is on everybody's minds because of the current geopolitical context.
Sure. I mean, I think, part of that process needs to be identifying the priorities where, adversarial states, want to focus. And there doesn't necessarily have to be common ground between those priorities. I mean, I think the beauty of a summit process is that, states can advance different priorities that are important to them. And then ideally, throughout the course of the summits, you bring others along, as that norm builds, as support for an idea builds, or as you're able to have those more in-depth conversations to demonstrate the value of a proposal to try to, change minds. And, not to put you on the spot, Scott, but one thing that I would be interested in, if you could, provide any insight into, is, how kind of states approached the idea of gift baskets. Were these ideas that kind of grew organically? Did states come in looking for areas? Because I think that aspect, the gift basket aspect in particular, again, is where some of these questions really could be answered, right? If you have a group of like-minded states with a shared priority, ensuring space within the summit process to advance that, and really demonstrating how the process will support a state's interest in that topic, I think that can be very useful in trying to navigate the geopolitical divisions, and again, demonstrate that the summit process is looking to consider a range of disarmament ideas, irrespective of whether every nuclear armed state wants to advance that in a given moment.
Yeah, I'll add a couple thoughts on that. So the gift baskets kind of, as you noted, evolved over the course of the summits. And, in the case of 2014, perhaps the most meaningful gift basket was from the host, from the Dutch. They proposed basically that countries would commit to implement nuclear security guidance as like their baseline standard. So basically taking guidance and turning it into a legal requirement in that country. And so, so that's a case of the host wanting to, add something to the process. In 2016, we wanted to make sure that we had, something that could kind of live beyond the summit process, because we knew that was going to be the last one. So in addition to the gift baskets, we had action plans, right, for the 5 international organizations that are most prevalent in nuclear security, and basically commitments from the countries to strengthen those international organizations. But the gift baskets then really became, different countries kind of came to the table with ideas, but there was a deliberate process where we're like, we need to have something on insider threat, on counter nuclear smuggling, on transportation security, like kind of the key issues related to nuclear security. So some of it was organically, as the U.S. host, we had to kind of elicit some that we thought were really important. But I'd also note, in fairness, that not every country liked the gift basket process. Some countries wanted everything to be consensus as part of that process. And so there were objections to the gift basket process among the Nuclear Security Summit partners. And, so, some didn't participate in any of those as a result of that position. And then just to go back to the question of Russia, I agree that Russia would need to be a part of this process, but the Disarmament Summit process. Russia was a part of the first 3 nuclear security summits, but then after the takeover of Crimea and parts of eastern Ukraine, it pulled out of the process and was not a part of the 2016 nuclear security summit. But they were kept in the loop, and they knew what was going on and were aware of all the kind of negotiations and the process there. So that example might work as you think about how the difficulties in engaging officially with Russia right now between the United States and Russia. But I would point to what Daryl said. We shouldn't think too much in the September 2024 frame of mind. Things are changing. I mean, you started this report in 2016 and almost released it in 2022. There's been a ton of changes in that time. So there can also be positive changes in the world, and hopefully, we're facing a different situation in the not too distant future.
All right. Any thoughts on that question, Ulrich? Or all right, we're running out of time for today's virtual rollout event, and I want to remind everybody that the Nuclear Disarmament Summit's report, a proposal for rejuvenating progress toward a world free of nuclear weapons, is online at armscontrol.org. We've had a number of questions about some other issues in the nuclear weapons policy disarmament space. There is a lot on our website about some of those other issues that we're not making time for today. We hope this has been interesting, stimulating. Our concept here is to get the conversation going about this idea. We welcome constructive criticism and ideas about how this idea could be improved. And I also just want to offer some thanks. And before I give Kelsey a chance for a final word, I want to thank Kelsey herself for her hard work and thoughtfulness on this report. I speak for both of us when I say that we're relieved to have this out there after a long process and some delays. I want to thank Arms Control Association members for the support that made the research work possible. Also want to thank the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation again for their dedicated support on this project. And let me also thank Ulrich and Scott for their time and insights. We look forward to more of your thoughts and others in the expert community about the Disarmament Summit's comments report. And I want to also thank everybody who's joined us online here. We're sorry to those of you who we could not get to your questions. We had a large number, but we welcome your participation, your activism, and interest in the days and weeks ahead. Kelsey, any final parting words this day?
Well, thank you, Daryl, for moderating, and just to echo your thanks to Ulrich and Scott for the very thoughtful feedback and comments. I mean, it certainly spurred some additional thinking for me about how to take this project forward, to build on it. And also, again, just my gratitude to both of you for your willingness to entertain and consider this sort of bold idea. Again, really grateful for your feedback, you're taking the time to discuss, and your insightful comments, which I said, certainly I'll be taking into account. And to those of you watching, particularly if we didn't get to your questions, I said, please feel free to reach out. Because like I said, we want to continue the conversation about this. And Daryl and I will be thinking about how to continue to support this idea and take it forward. So the feedback is welcome, even though the report is out. So thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, everybody. This will be archived on the Arms Control Association website, this webinar. You can look for that in the next few days. And with that, we are adjourned. Goodbye, everybody.